So we are starting chapter 28, the respiratory system today. Let's dive right into it. So here are your learning objectives. The anatomic structures and physiologic processes of the respiratory system, describes specific structures of the upper and lower respiratory tracts, discuss breathing, respiration, and reflexes that affect breathing, and name the types of pathologic conditions of the respiratory system. Again, Ms. Hurt will always do your pathology. So for the introduction, cells need oxygen. We have to have oxygen to survive. Respiratory and cardiovascular systems work together to accomplish this. The respiratory system brings the oxygen in, the carbon dioxide out, and the cardiovascular system makes sure it's delivered. Failure of either system causes rapid cell death from oxygen deprivation. These both systems have to work constantly from the time we are born until we die. They are working. There's things that go wrong. Phlegm is mucus secreted by the respiratory tract. Sputum is phlegm mixed with saliva from the digestive tract. And pulmonology is the study of the respiratory system. So they do kind of have some mixing. The basic anatomy, your nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, alveoli, and lungs, not in any particular order. The physiology, the functions of the respiratory system are the exchange of gases, both carbon dioxide and oxygen, olfaction, which is our sense of smell, sound production, speech and non-speech sounds, and maintaining homeostasis. We'll see that the respiratory system does function in our acid-base balance. Here's a kind of overview picture of the respiratory system. It is divided into both upper and lower respiratory tracts. The upper respiratory tract being from your nasal cavity down to about the trachea, and then below that, from your bronchi to your alveoli, are your lower respiratory tracts. Again, upper is nasal to larynx, lower is trachea to the lungs. There are also accessory structures, your rib cage, your diaphragm, and other respiratory muscles. Remember, your diaphragm is your primary muscle for respiration, your rib cage is enclosing them. I'm sure you can name some of the other respiratory muscles, your scalenes, your SCM, your serratus posterior, all of those function in respiration. Here's a more detailed picture of the upper respiratory tract. So you can see a couple of the sinuses, the frontal and the sphenoid sinuses, the nasal cavity right in here. These are called the nasal conchae. These ridges right here are the nasal concha. They actually help to disrupt airflow. So air passes, it comes in through the nose and then it passes in between these structures. If these weren't here, air wouldn't slow down enough and it would kind of choke us because it would just come straight in and hit the back of our nasal cavity, go down our throat, and it would just kind of happen too fast. This helps to kind of break up and disrupt the airflow. There are superior, middle, and inferior concha. They help to break up the airflow, so it's just not as difficult. It just makes it easier to breathe. We can also have our oral cavity. You have the larynx right here, which is a structure. It has both the epiglottis and the vocal cords. So your voice box and your larynx, same thing. Your epiglottis covers the trachea, which leads to your lungs. So that way when you swallow food, the epiglottis closes over and then food is shunted into the esophagus back here. Again, the trachea is going to lead into your lungs. We can talk about, so the region from the nose up until the larynx is the pharynx. It's your throat. It is divided into three portions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. So from nasal cavity to right at the larynx, you have the pharynx, your throat. There are right and left halves of the nasal cavity, so in your nose. Again, this whole portion is the nasal cavity. They're separated by your septum. I have my septum pierced. That's what that piercing is on your septum. The anterior nares, the nares are your nostrils, the entrance to the nasal cavity. You have posterior nares, which are just, again, openings to the pharynx. The conchae, your ridge projections. The meatus is the passageway between the conchae. So the conchae are the actual ridges, and the meatus is the space that the air flows between them. There are goblet cells producing mucus, and then epistaxis. Epistaxis is a nosebleed. So the nasal cavity is air conditioning chambers. So during inhalation, what this means is not that it cools air down. It means that it literally conditions the air. So during inhalation, Air is warmed by passing over the superficial blood vessels. It's, remember, very easy to kind of have nosebleeds because you have so many superficial blood vessels. Those also allow air to be warmed up very, very quickly. So doesn't matter how cold it is outside, the air coming in will be warmed. It will also be moistened by this mucus. And it'll be cleansed by hairs trapping follicles and mucus also trapping particles. So it doesn't matter if you are in the desert and the air is bone dry, or if you are even better in like a tundra where it's a frozen tundra, so it's not only cold but it's also dry. Air will be warmed to body temperature by the superficial blood vessels, and it will be moistened by mucus, so that by the time air gets to your into your lungs, it is both body temperature and 100% humidity. Even if it starts off, at 0%, it will be up to 100% by the time it gets to your lungs, because that humid environment is required for gas exchange. So untrapped particles stick in mucus and are swallowed or expelled by coughing and sneezing. And the cilia assist with these processes. So the hair in our nose, in our nasal cavity, those are called vibrissae. Those are bigger and thicker. As you go down the respiratory tract, you start to develop cilia, which are finer, smaller hairs that still assist with this same process. You have paranasal sinuses, so alongside the nose, your sinuses, lined with mucosa that open into the nasal cavities. They help to lighten the skull and provide resonance for sound. So what allows me to make so much loud noise all the time is because we have these sinuses that help to provide more of an echo. There are frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary sinuses. These are named after bones. So your frontal is on your frontal bone superior to the eyebrows. Your sphenoid bone is posterior to your eyes, just posterior to it. The ethmoid is between the nasal cavities and the eyes, so a little more lateral. And the maxillary are inferior to the cheeks and superior to the teeth. These are your largest sinuses. These are the ones, if you just kind of push on either side of your nose, right on the zygomatic bone, kind of those apples of your cheeks, you'll feel your maxillary sinuses, and you probably might even feel like a little bit of pressure being shifted in your head. And there you go. So yeah, what's kind of confusing, it makes it look like these are which they are kind of further back, but really it's more of a lateral thing. So you have your frontal and your maxillary, then you have your ethmoid and your sphenoid behind those. So your pharynx. This is a tube from the nasal cavity of the larynx, called your throat. It has the naso, the oro, and the laryngopharynx. We kind of all saw this. The naso being the superior, the oro being the one, the mouth, and the laryngo is the inferior region, the most right above larynx. The larynx is segmented cartilaginous tissue connecting pharynx to the trachea, so it's called your voice box. Its largest segment is the thyroid cartilage, which kind of creates that shield right in front of it. On men, you see the Adam's apple, that projection, that's part of the thyroid cartilage as well. It also has a glottis, which contains the vocal cords or the vocal folds. Narrowing the glottis produces high-pitched sounds. Widening the glottis produces low-pitched sounds. So the glottis is just an area within the larynx. The epiglottis, epi meaning upon, forms a flap over the glottis during swallowing to prevent food and water into the esophagus. It's the guardian of the airways. So this is helping to make sure that food just moves in the right way and with sound production. Your trachea goes from your larynx to your bronchi, so we're going down the respiratory passage. Located anterior to the esophagus, it's also called your windpipe. This is just those cartilaginous rings, and if you kind of palpate the front of your trachea, you can feel the rings, the individual rings. It contains a half-ring cartilages. So they're half-ring because it's in front of the esophagus. So you have your trachea, and then right behind your trachea is your esophagus. When your esophagus is empty, when you're not swallowing anything, it flattens. But when you swallow, it kind of bulges out. And so these half-ring cartilages, the posterior side of the trachea is flattened so that the esophagus can expand a little bit into it. If it were round fully, if it was a full circle shape instead of just a C, then your esophagus wouldn't have any room to expand. Oh, there is that. It says it right there. Yep, keeps walls open during breathing, and it bifurcates into the right and left primary bronchi. So it splits. Your trachea, you have one trachea, and then it splits into a left and a right primary bronchus. The carina is located at the bifurcation that causes coughing when stimulated by debris or foreign objects. So where the left and the right bronchi split, right in the middle, inside of the trachea, is this little projection called the carina. And if any material isn't trapped by the mucus or by hairs, then they will stimulate the carina and cause you to cough to release anything before it gets into your lungs. Once your trachea split, they become your bronchi. You have two primary bronchi, your right and your left. The right is wider and steeper to reflect the larger size of the right lung. Usually that's where inhaled objects get stuck. The bronchioles are smaller branches of the bronchi. They change their diameter because they contain less cartilage and more smooth muscle. Bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction allows for more and less airflow. If you bronchodilate, then you're going to allow more air to come in. Bronchoconstrict, you allow less air to come in. So you start from your nasal cavity, you go down your pharynx, into your larynx, into the trachea, and now into our bronchi and our bronchioles. And here's just kind of that image of how they divide. So as you go down from your trachea, you have your primary bronchi. Right as soon as the primary bronchi split, you have your secondary, or right after that, you have your secondary. After the secondary split, you have tertiary, and then it goes on and on until about 16 different divisions. So all the way down to these smallest little bronchioles, you're going to be about 16 divisions from this primary bronchus. So the alveoli. These are the functional units of the lungs. This is where the gas exchange actually occurs. So these are air sacs attached to alveolar ducts that are part of the bronchioles. Primary gas exchange structures, surrounded by capillaries and coated with surfactants. The surfactants help to stabilize the alveoli, they reduce surface tension and keep the walls from sticking together. So they allow the alveoli to kind of move and expand and contract with respiration. So when you think about yourself breathing in, we kind of just think about, oh, the diaphragm pulls down and our lungs inflate. What's inflating are these little tiny air sacs called alveoli. As millions and millions and hundreds of millions of alveoli kind of expand, they allow our lungs to expand, and then as they empty out their air, the air travels through these alveolar ducts into the bronchioles, back out through the trachea. As that air comes in and out through the ducts, the alveoli contract and expand, and the lungs contract and expand with them. They're surrounded by capillaries to allow for gas exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Here is just an example of one. So you have this capillary wall, you have a red blood cell, and right here is the respiratory membrane. So you have oxygen going in, carbon dioxide coming out. So this is your alveoli. This is your capillary. This red blood cell was full of carbon dioxide from the body, full of the body's been working, it produces carbon dioxide and that has to go out. So this red blood cell is going to diffuse its carbon dioxide across the capillary membrane, very, very thin membrane here, while oxygen goes from the alveoli, which is bringing fresh air in, that's going to diffuse that way. They go based on their concentration gradients. So you have more oxygen on the alveoli, more carbon dioxide on the red blood cells, so they're going to move down their concentration gradients. See the fluid here that's containing the surfactant. So you have the alveolar membrane, and then just outside of that is the surfactant that's helping to keep it open. The lungs are the primary organs of respiration. The inferior surface attaches to the diaphragm, which is what allows them to expand. The exterior surface is lined by pleural membranes. So pleural membranes are different types of synovial membranes in your body. They have a visceral pleura that attaches to the lungs. So viscera is going to attach to the organ. The parietal section will attach to the chest wall. So the visceral pleura attaches to the lungs, so the parietal pleura attaches to the chest wall. And then there's serous fluid in between. I'm sorry, I said synovial membrane. It's a serous membrane. There's serous fluid located between these two membranes, that helps reduce friction during breathing. So it allows the lungs to expand and contract just like the surfactant did. And actually the fluid is called pulmonary surfactant. So breathing is the process of taking in and expelling air from lungs. We can divide it into inhalation and exhalation. The diaphragm is that main muscle of respiration, and at rest we breathe about 12 to 16 times per minute. The larger the animal, the larger the creature, I guess I should say, the less that it breathes, whereas the smaller it is, the more that it breathes. The medulla oblongata regulates our breathing. It's part of your brainstem. And the phrenic nerve is the specific nerve that initiates inhalation. This is the one that that innervates our diaphragm and kind of pulls it down so that our lungs can expand. Voluntary breathing allows breath held underwater or deep breaths to project voice. So it's how long can the breath be held is determined by the levels of carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide starts to build up, you will be forced to exhale. Breathing rate increases as body temperature rises, whether that be with fever or with exercise. That's why one of the common signs of kind of having a fever and being sick is also typically being a little short of breath and kind of getting winded easily. Rate decreases as body temperature lowers. Hypothermia, jumping into cold water, all of these things are going to slow your body processes down, and it's going to make you conserve your energy. Your emotions can also alter your rate. Do not downplay the role of emotions in regulating your breathing. So when we inhale, it's the process of moving air into the lungs. It's also called inspiration. What happens is the diaphragm contracts and it moves down, increasing the size of the rib cage. The pressure in the lungs becomes lower compared to the atmospheric pressure. So the pressure inside of your lungs is lower than the pressure outside of your lungs. And air always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So it's going to move, in this case, when we're inhaling, it's going to move from this higher pressure in that outside in the atmosphere to the lower pressure inside of our lungs. Compliance refers to the ease of the thorax and lungs to stretch during inhalation. Certain respiratory illnesses and diseases will affect compliance, lung compliance. So here you can see the diaphragm contracts, it moves down. It's going to go from this dome shape to a more flattened shape. As it does that, the rib cage size increases, the chest expands, and the pressure, because we're increasing the volume, we're decreasing our pressure. So we're increasing the size, which increases the thoracic volume. If you increase the space, you're going to decrease the pressure. It's kind of like if I took all of us and I put us all into a room that was 5 by 5, we would be so stuck together and we would probably have really high pressure. We would probably all be very intense. But if I took us and I kept the same, our 9 group of students, and I moved us from a 5 by 5 room to a 50 by 50 room, I'm keeping the contents the same, but I'm increasing the space, which decreases our pressure. We can move away from each other and we can decrease our pressure. That's what happens in inhalation. You increase the space within the lungs, that decreases the pressure and allows more air to fill in. Exhalation is the opposite. It's also called expiration, and what happens is the diaphragm relaxes, moves up, and the rib cage decreases in its size. This is a passive process. It really does not take any muscles. You can do forced exhalations, but typically the diaphragm relaxing is a passive process where inhalation is an active one. As the ribcage decreases in its size, the pressure in the lungs becomes higher compared to atmospheric pressure, because now you're taking those lungs that are full of air, you're decreasing the size, so you're taking, going from that 50 by 50 room, which maybe once we move to a bigger room, our 10 people now increase to 50 people. So we're 50 people in a 50 by 50 room. But as that room starts to shrink, as that space starts to decrease, people are going to run out. They're not going to want to stay until we go back down to our resting state. Air still moves from high pressure to low pressure, but when we're exhaling, the high pressure is from lungs to the atmosphere, to outside. The elastic recoil is the tendency of the lungs to return to their pre-inhalation size. So just how easily can you exhale? And not even just exhale, but how easily can you return to that pre-inhalation size? If the lungs do not return fully to the pre-inhalation size, it becomes harder to take in a full breath, because you need that full time for the lungs to expand to really fill up the lungs. People with emphysema, they typically have a hard time emptying their lungs. Their lungs they lose that elasticity. And so they can't return to their pre-inhalation size. So that's why you hear people with emphysema kind of wheezing, because they can only take in short, shallower breaths. And there you go, you see the opposite. It relaxes, it moves up to more dome shape, it decreases thoracic volume, which pushes air out. So those two processes are respiration. Those two processes are breathing. Respiration is an internal process. Well, they do external and internal respiration. It's very good. So respiration supplies the cells with oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. There is external respiration and internal respiration. We were looking at external respiration just then with the process of breathing. Both of these occur by diffusion. So diffusion is the tendency of molecules to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. If you don't remember diffusion, you might want to review some kind of YouTube videos, crash course videos, or your notes, because we did do this, but it was last semester. So diffusion is a passive process. It does not take any energy. You're just going from high to low. And in this case, we're talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. We're talking about two chemicals. So external respiration is the gas exchange between air in the alveoli and blood in capillaries. So air in the alveoli, which are in the lungs, and blood in the capillaries, which surround the alveoli. So as oxygen diffuses from air in the lungs, it crosses the respiratory membrane across the alveoli and the capillaries and moves into the bloodstream where these capillaries are. Carbon dioxide is going to move opposite direction. It's going to go from the capillaries across the respiratory membrane and then diffuse into the alveoli so they can be exhaled out the body. External respiration is also known as pulmonary respiration. So this is exchanging of gases between the alveoli and the air, between the lungs and the air. So they call it external because you are exhaling air and inhaling air. So it's coming from the external environment. That's why it's external respiration, even though this is occurring in the lungs. So oxygen goes from lungs to the bloodstream, whereas carbon dioxide goes from bloodstream to the alveoli and the lungs, which can then be exhaled out. Because remember, carbon dioxide is a waste product. For internal respiration, this is exchange between blood in the capillaries and cells within the tissues. So remember that blood coming to the tissues, to the body tissues, it has now all of this extra blood. So I went back to the, oh wait, no, there we go. So for internal respiration, these capillaries are filled with, sorry y'all, I'm going to stay on this slide. So gas exchange between air in the alveoli and blood in the capillaries. Remember that the blood in this capillaries is now filled with all of that, all of that blood in the capillaries is filled with all of that fresh oxygen that it just got in the lungs from external respiration. So now this blood is filled with oxygen that can be taken to the body tissues. At the body tissues, the cells are going to be filled with carbon dioxide that has to be released. So carbon dioxide diffuses from the cells, crosses the capillary wall, and enters the blood. Once the carbon dioxide enters the blood, some of it will attach to hemoglobin, which is a carrier molecule. It's a protein. But most of it will combine with water to form carbonic acid, which is expelled during exhalation. It only stays at carbonic acid for a moment. It then becomes bicarbonate, which is another molecule that allows the pH of the blood to stay the same. Once it gets back to the lungs, this carbonic acid bicarbonate is converted back into carbon dioxide and expelled as that. So carbonic acid is not what you exhale. You exhale carbon dioxide. But because the body can't just carry carbon dioxide, it has to convert it to something else for that trip. And then once it gets to the lungs, it's converted back into carbon dioxide and exhaled out. So internal respiration is your tissue respiration. This is bringing oxygen from the lungs to the body and carbon dioxide from the body to the lungs. Sneezing affects our breathing. It's a forceful expulsion of air through the nose and mouth to clear the upper respiratory pathways. You can cough, which is a sudden expulsion of air to clear the lower respiratory tract. Hiccups are spasmodic closures of vocal cords after forceful contraction of respiratory muscles. So your diaphragm, your intercostals kind of will contract quickly, and then the vocal cords will open and close spasmodically. And then yawning is deep inhalations initiated by opening mouth wide. There is still no scientific conclusion as to why we yawn. There are a lot of different theories, but none of them have been conclusively proven. The one that I tend to kind of go with the most is that typically when we yawn, it's because our breathing rate has slowed down. So maybe you're getting tired and you're not breathing as much. And it's kind of your body's way of trying to bring in more oxygen and exhale out more carbon dioxide. But even that has its holes. So there really isn't a consensus as to why we actually yawn. And the rest are just pathologies.